Okay, chapter 19, we're going to talk about amines and start our conversation about biochemistry. So, amines are organic compounds that have nitrogen atoms in them, um, which are classified by the number of alkyl groups bonded to the nitrogen atom. So, we've talked a little bit about some of the naming. So, a primary amine is a nitrogen with only one R group. A secondary amine has two R groups, and a tertiary amine has three R groups. All right. The primary, secondary, and tertiary amines have a lone pair of electrons, which we usually don't write. So, I mean, here they have them, but sometimes it's not written. However, we can also have what's called a quaternary amine, where the lone pair is actually preoccupied being bonded by another R group. So you can actually have four R groups, and the nitrogen has a positive charge because one of the electrons from the lone pairs is being shared with one of the R groups. So you don't have a lone pair, and this is what's called a quaternary amine, and it's actually what's called an ammonium ion. All right, so because of this, amines can actually act as a base. Okay, so in organic molecules, the acids are carboxylic acids and our bases are amines because of the lone pair of nitrogen and the fact that it can share those lone pairs and form a quaternary amine. All right, amines can be part of a cyclical structure. These are special types of amines. They're called heterocycles. I believe we've talked about this term before, but a heterocycle is basically any type of compound, a cyclical organic compound where you have a non-carbon group, such as a nitrogen or an oxygen or a sulfur. In this case, we have nitrogens. So this is a very common compound called piperidine. And here is another organic molecule that has a piperidine structure in it plus a propyl group. All right, just kind of some structural attributes of amines. They are trigonal pyramidal. Bond angles are about 109.5. Let's see, that's pretty much it. Primary amines are named with either a common name or a systematic name. The systematic name is basically the IUPAC name, which you find the longest continuous chain of carbons that include the nitrogen, and you drop the E. So if it's an ethane, you drop the E and you name it ethanamine. And then you do all these substitutions based on the rules that we've learned. So kind of the common name is this is called methylamine because you have a methyl group and then the amine, or the actual IUPAC name is methanamine. Here is butylamine, pretty straightforward. There's a butyl group plus an amine, but the systematic name is 1-butanamine because the one carbon has a nitrogen. Because the nitrogen could be on the second carbon. That'd be called 2-butanamine. All right. You can also have secondary and tertiary amines where the groups are identical. If the groups are identical, you just name it with either di or tri, depending on if it's a di-substituted or tri-substituted. So triethylamine, dipropylamine, these are pretty straightforward. Okay. How to name secondary, tertiary where the alkyl groups are different. We have different groups. So in this case, our longest chain has 3 carbons and the nitrogen is attached to the second carbon. So this methyl is so this is our parent compound. It's the longest chain of carbons and the nitrogen is attached to the second carbon. So we have to tell the reader that there's a methyl group on the amine, and then we also have to tell them that it's a 2-propylamine. Okay, and the way that you do that, so here we go. So our longest chain is 3 carbons. It's a propanamine or propylamine. You can use either one, but you have to tell the reader it's 2 because the nitrogen's on the second carbon. But you need to tell the reader that the methyl group is also on the nitrogen. So you do that by putting an N on the outside of the name, and you call it N-methyl. So you see how it's N-methyl to propanamide. That should be amine, not an amide. That is incorrect. That should be an N. The methyl this methyl's on the nitrogen. So you show that by saying N-methyl. On the nitrogen, I have a methyl, and then it's a 2-propanamine. Okay? Um, so hopefully that makes sense. If you have a tertiary, if you have another methyl group here, all right, that'd be called NN-dimethyl 2-propanamine. NN dimethyl, because you have two groups and you have to say NN twice. So N, comma, N dimethyl propanamine. All right, amines in aromatic rings are called anilines. So this compound is called aniline. So this would be called N-ethyl aniline, because this is my parent, the aniline, and we have an ethyl group hanging off of the nitrogen. All right, this is called orthobromoaniline because the 1,2 spot is the ortho spot. All right, here are also some pretty common heterocycles with amines. So piperidine we've already seen, pyrrolidine and pyridine and pyrrole. These types of structures we find actually in RNA and in DNA. They're actually one of our bases in those compounds, and we'll probably see them later. All right, amines have some really bad smell to them. They have a rotten fish smell, or the smell of urine or bad breath. For urine, obviously it makes sense because we have amines and ammonia inside our urine. Also fish, why does fish have that fishy smell? Well, it's because the proteins in fish, once a fish dies, they produce an enzyme and it starts breaking down all of their proteins in all the muscle in the fish, and the proteins break down into amines, and the amines have this fishy smell to it. It just has a foul smell that we recognize as a fishy smell. Amines are polar because they contain a carbon nitrogen and a hydrogen on the nitrogen. So you definitely have hydrogen bonding. Not as strong as if you had an oxygen, but you definitely have hydrogen bonding. So primary and secondary amines can have intermolecular hydrogen bonding. So because of that, the boiling points are relatively high, not as high as alcohols, but they're probably next in highest. All right, so primary and secondary amines have high boiling points than compounds that do not. So if you look at ether, very low. All right, with an amine with about the same amount of carbons on it, you can see that the boiling point is about double. And obviously an alcohol is a little bit more because oxygen is more electronegative, so this hydrogen is much more partially positive compared to the hydrogen on the nitrogen. All right, so primary and secondary amines have lower boiling points than alcohols, but amines have higher boiling points than pretty much any other functional group other than carboxylic acids. Tertiary amines, on the other hand, have very low boiling points because you don't have a hydrogen to really form hydrogen bonding. So tertiary amines have almost the same boiling points as an ether. So you can tell this 6-carbon amine has the same boiling point as a 4-carbon ether. Okay. Here are some common amines that we find in everyday lives. So caffeine is a common one that's found in chocolate and in coffee and tea. So here's a structured caffeine. We did the isolation of caffeine from tea, so we actually have seen that structure already. Also nicotine, here's a structure of nicotine. It's a pretty simple compound. You can see that we have a pyridine group and a pyrrole group. So that's a structure of nicotine. Any compound that is naturally occurring are called alkaloids, and particularly an alkaloid not only is a naturally occurring compound, but usually it's a naturally occurring compound that has a nitrogen in it. Not always, but usually that's kind of what they imply. All right, caffeine, here's just some characteristics we know about this: coffee, tea. It's a mild stimulant, increases the heart rate, and the signaling for glucose production so a person feels energetic. The effects are temporary. So you have to keep consuming it to maintain your high. So I wouldn't really consider it a high, but I guess they do. In moderation, caffeine possesses no health risks, but for pregnant and nursing women and for high doses, you could have issues. Caffeine is somewhat addicting. Anyone that drinks coffee knows that for sure. All right, I think this is kind of a cool little table kind of to show you the amount of grams or the amount of milligrams of caffeine in certain things. So You can see that in coffee has one of the highest. Instant coffee, interesting enough, has much lower, and that's because the water doesn't steep or sit through the coffee that long. If you use a French press, if you know what a French press is, using a French press has one of the highest amounts of caffeine. The reason is because the coffee just sits in the hot water, it simmers in the hot water for a long time, and it's able to extract out a lot more of that caffeine. But instant coffee, doesn't have as much caffeine. Decaffeinated obviously has very small amounts. Tea, you can see, has about a half to a third of the amount of brew. It's interesting, I didn't realize that, but tea and instant coffee are about the same. That's kind of interesting. Here's Coke and Diet Coke. Didn't realize Diet Coke has more. That's kind of interesting. Chocolate has a very small amount. Dark chocolate has more. And then you have like no-dose and all those things. No-dose has quite a bit of caffeine in it. All right, nicotine, on the other hand, is highly toxic. It comes from tobacco. It acts as a stimulant. It's very addictive, much more addictive than caffeine. However, obviously, they want to talk about smoking causes lung and heart disease. That's not the only way that you can get nicotine. They have like all the patches. I think you can even buy like a tablet that has nicotine in it. Because of the powerful addictiveness of nicotine, trying to quit smoking is difficult because of the fact it's so addictive. However, there are things like the patch that we talked about. All right, let's see. I think this is just kind of showing pictures of how you get nicotine. Here's kind of the plant that they grow, and then they dry it out, and here are kind of the dried leaves, and then eventually it goes into a cigarette. All right, so let's call it right there for the first 4 sections. Then when we come back, we'll talk about more types of alkaloids.